Psalms 105 will be our text today, but we won't be there just yet. The first place we'll be at, you can mark Psalms 105 and we'll be going there at some point. The first place we'll be today is Isaiah chapter 48. Isaiah 48. The title of this is The Furnace of Affliction. The Furnace of Affliction. Sounds like a fun message, doesn't it? I'm going to keep this simple. I don't normally do this, but the points will all spell a word. This is an acrostic, so it'll help you remember it. The Furnace of Affliction. What's a furnace? A furnace is a fire. So our points will spell fire. F-I-R-E. All right, Isaiah chapter 48, verse 10 to 11. Isaiah 48, verse 10 to 11. He says, "Behold, I have refined thee, but not with silver. I have chosen thee in the furnace of affliction. For mine own sake, even for mine own sake will I do it. For how should my name be polluted? And I will not give my glory to another." God right there says, I'm going to choose people. I'm going to have some special trophies down there. And you know the ones I'm going to pick from? I'm going to pick from the ones that are in the fire, in the furnace of affliction. Those are the ones I'm picking. So, if you want to be something for God, count on getting in the fire. He says that's where I choose my people from, the furnace of affliction. It's important to be in it. Everyone loves the underdog story. If you're going to watch a movie or you're going to read a book, you want to hear the story about the guy who was about to lose it all and everything was, he was at wit's end, and then out of nowhere, everything turned around and he got on top. That's the storyline we all want to hear because it's ours. That's the way God does. He came to this earth and he said, I'm seeking for certain people. I'm not looking for the people who are already superstars. I'm not looking for the ones who already have all the health they need. I'm here for those that are sick. I'm here for those that are down and out, the ones who know they need help. And that's why I'm here. That's what he came for, the underdog. So, guess what? Your life, you don't feel like you're the underdog. You're going to be in the furnace of affliction. Get ready for it. It's going to be there. He says in Psalms 105, verse 16. This is a recount. You'll find this all through the Psalms. He'll go through and give you the history of Israel. All the way through, I can't tell you how many times, but just over and over, you see the history of Israel from the beginning to the end. Psalm 78 is another good passage like this. You find this psalm right here is nearly identical. There's about 15 verses that are nearly identical to 1 Chronicles 16. And that's a fun one to do. When you get home, look at that one. 1 Chronicles 16 and compare it to Psalms 105 and see where words change. Because where words change will give you a definition of each other. You'll find out Abraham represents Israel, and it'll go back and forth like that. But this whole psalm, it begins with, hey, let's get all excited, let's praise and happy times. And you see that? The beginning of our psalm, Psalms 105. Look there at verse 1. Give thanks. All right, we're excited. Verse 2, sing. Verse 3, glory in his holy name. All right, it's all happy, happy, happy. But then he's going to tell us why. And the story that he's about to tell us is not one that we would have that natural reaction to. So guess what? In your life, there's going to be times you're supposed to do this. Give thanks, sing, and glory in his name when it doesn't feel like it. Because the story he's about to tell is one that we wouldn't want to live through. We'll focus on Joseph's life in this. Verse 16. Moreover, he called for a famine in the land. He brake the whole staff of bread. Wow. That sounds like happy times. How are we going to be thankful and praise and get all excited when it's a famine? So the first thing you're going to notice in the furnace of affliction, our first letter is famine. Get used to it. Famine is going to happen. That's one element to the furnace. And it will happen. It happens over and over. It's God who called for the famine here. It wasn't the devil. It was God. God said, I'm going to have a famine down there. Famine's important to me. He ordered it. In Amos chapter 3, verse 6, he says, y'all don't have to turn there, I'll read it to you. Amos 3:6, he says, shall a trumpet be blown in the city, and the people not be afraid? For us, it would be, can a police car drive down the highway with the sirens roaring and not everybody run out and say, hey, where's that? Who just got busted? That's our response to it. He goes on and he says, shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord hath not done it? Okay, that doesn't sound like something we would normally say. If there's evil there, God did it. He allowed it. By his permitting it, that's his permissive will, he allowed it. The responsibility goes right back to him, because he had the ability to disallow it, and he didn't. Okay, so the famine is by command. It's by the demand of God. They departed from the promised land for this famine. This is the famine that happens during Jacob's time, when they leave Canaan and come into Egypt. Okay, there's a famine, there's bad news. But you know what they just did by doing that? They lost their land. That was what they were promised. They were promised Canaan. But there's a famine. So as far as they're concerned, the promise they had been given is a pipe dream. It's done. It's over. They're leaving. Canaan doesn't do them any good. There's a famine there. God's blessings sometimes seem that way to us. Okay, he said this and he said that, but hey, look where I am now. It didn't do any good. Now I've got to do this over here. He knows what he's doing. Hang on. Don't give up. A famine, it's going to happen. Now, there's famines all throughout the Bible. I'm going to read these to you really fast, and you'll have to probably watch it on the video because there's too much here for me to slow down. There's a famine in Canaan in Abraham's day. That'll be in Genesis 12. There's in Canaan, there's another famine in Isaac's day. That's Genesis 26. In Canaan, there's one in Jacob's day we just read about. You find that again in Genesis 41. In Canaan during the Judges, that'll be in Ruth chapter 1. In Canaan in David's day, 2 Samuel 21:1. In Elijah's day, in 1 Kings 17. In Elijah's day, in Elisha's day in Samaria. That's in, you just have to get the notes. I got to read these fast. We got to get moving. There's also a famine in Jerusalem in Zedekiah's day. There's a famine in Canaan in Nehemiah's day. And then there's one in Luke 15 and Luke 4, and there's also one in Acts 11 under the Roman Empire. Famine is over and over. If you're going to be a special servant of God, all of these men were the patriarchs. Paul, they're all the men who we think of as great and that God used. Guess what? We find them in a famine. In the furnace of affliction, you find a famine. Always. No exception. Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. Philippians 1:29. Hunger propels a man to find nourishment. When you're starving, you really don't think about a whole lot other than, I got to get this hunger taken care of. Give me some food. You really get hungry, it becomes an all-consuming thought. I've got to get food. Food, really, if you think about it, food is not found at the grocery store. The source of food. The source of food is not found at the farmer's field. That's not the source of food. Because the farmer might have a field that doesn't produce anything. So we got to go farther back to where we can be sure there's food. Well, that's God. You know, the one who can take a dead seed, feed it some dry dirt, and produce a plant. That's power. That's God. That's where food comes from. There's a famine in our day today. Right now, there is a famine. And it's not from the stuff at the grocery store. Although if you start investigating, you'll realize the stuff at the grocery store has way less nutrients than it's ever had. There is a famine, both physically and spiritually. But there's a definite famine spiritually. Spiritually, people are starving and they don't even know it. There is not much desire for just pure Word of God. There's not. There's a lot of desire for books about God. There's a lot of desire for, let's figure out what he really meant, and can I put in there something I really like, and we'll just force the Bible to say it. There's a lot of that. But there's not a whole lot of hunger and thirst for the pure, unadulterated Word of God. There's not. There's a famine now. In Philippians 1, verse 29, he says, "For unto you is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him." Okay, so we would assume that's right. We should believe on him, and it's a gift given to every person that they can believe on Jesus Christ. That's a great gift. Well, it didn't stop there. Let's keep reading. "But also to suffer for his sake." Okay, furnace of affliction. The gift. Now, when you're going to refine something, you throw it in the furnace to refine it. It's not because you hate the metal. It's because you want to refine it and make it better. And sometimes we feel like, hey, I'm nothing special. Why am I getting picked on? Because you don't think you're something special, but God put something special in there. He's going to burn off the dross that you think is you. He's going to get rid of that, so the only thing that shines through is the pure gold that's him, or the silver, the precious metal that he put in there. Let's look at a couple other passages. In Luke chapter 4, verse 25. Luke 4, verse 25. He says, "But I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elias, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, when great famine was throughout all the land." Okay? A famine does something. A famine, a real famine, if this country were to see a real famine, you'd see people turn to God. Not everybody. You'd still have a bunch of losers out there. But the people who were turning to God would be obvious. It would make a drastic line between the rejectors of God and the seekers of God. It would, yes.
Is this also referring to the tribulation?
It's going to repeat in the tribulation, yes. But he's talking about Elijah in the Old Testament. So there's a famine there, and it does something. It produces somebody out of nowhere. Sometimes God produces the famine in our lives in order to produce something special. Of all the ways to do it, why don't he just give me $1 million? That's not the way he chooses to do it. Look at it in Luke 21, verse 11. Here's your tribulation passage. Luke 21, 11. God uses a famine to refine people, to find out who's going to burn up and who's going to produce some gold. Some people just become chaff in the furnace. They just fizzle out. Luke 21, verse 11. "In the tribulation, he's going to do the famine again. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines, and pestilence, and fearful sightings, and great signs shall there be from heaven." So he's saying, look, I'm going to use the famine again because that's how I choose people. I put them in the furnace of affliction. And I see what goes on in the furnace of affliction. And the person who's seeking me in the furnace of affliction, I can use that person. He doesn't use the person that's sitting in Easy Street and has everything they need, and life is handing them everything they want. He can't use that person. He's got to test them. He's got to try them in the furnace of affliction. Look at it in Romans chapter 8, verse 35. Romans 8:35. There's comfort in the furnace. Romans 8, verse 35. Paul's saying, I'm going to tell you something that people don't realize. You would think this list of things that he's going to give would make you lose your love for Christ or Christ's love for you. And some people it does. But if you're a real Christian, it shouldn't. Romans 8:35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation? Some people drop out because of tribulation. But that doesn't separate you. The tribulation itself didn't do the separating. You did the separating. If somebody left, it wasn't because of tribulation. It was because they chose. Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or there's our word famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword. He says the famine is a key tool that God uses in the furnace of affliction. Famine is for sure. It's coming. The next thing he uses is Psalms 105, verse 17. In the furnace of affliction, we definitely see fire, and we'll see the famine. But then we see insult. Why would you add insult on top of a famine? I mean, hey, ain't we got enough already? Nope. He knows what he's doing. Psalms 105, verse 17. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant. Okay. Joseph is going to be their helper. He's going to be the man they need. When things really get rough, God says, I know what's going on. The place this mess is headed is going to be disastrous. I'm going to go ahead and circumvent the problem and send a man on ahead of them. Well, how's he do it? He doesn't put him in a chariot and, have a bunch of people praising him and, going up to the palace. No. The way he does it is he gets Joseph to be sold as a servant. Whew. Rough way to go, isn't it? That's the furnace of affliction. That's the way God does us. He does it that way on purpose. If Joseph had gone up there in all the pomp of a king, he wouldn't have learned some lessons he needed to be in position when the time was right. So God puts us through some things to teach us so that we'll be ready when the fire dies down. Notice hatred in our passage. He's sold for a servant. Hatred is the sin of man. Man loves to hate. We just do. That's the natural thing for a man, is if something contradicts my comfort or my self-esteem, then my response to that is hate. What happened to Joseph? He tells his brothers a dream. The brothers say, hey, wait a minute. You're saying you're important to me. I ain't standing for that. We'll fix you up. We'll fix you right up. And they did. They sold him for a slave. You know what God's response to this is? How do you think God would respond to that? If your brother said something that you didn't like and you sold him to a foreign country as a slave, you'd think God would beat him up for that. You know what his response was? He sent him a helper. Remember, God's after the underdog. It's the wicked person that needs help. You know why he sent Joseph over there? Joseph, out of his own mouth, says, hey, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to save life. He sent Joseph so that the brothers could come in and get help. Whew. That's not the way we would do it. We would say justice is, you did him wrong, I'm going to take care of you. We'll take you apart one piece at a time. But that's not the way God does it. God's response to man's hatred is help. Wow. We got a good God. Now, that just because the brothers did this horrible thing, and it was in God's plan to get Joseph over there, does not mean the brothers did right. This is where there's a difference between Calvinism and free will. The brothers still had free will. God could have chosen another way to get Joseph there. Somebody could have come in and kidnapped him and got him there. However, the brothers are still going to pay for their sin. They personally are responsible for the actions they took. Just because God intended Joseph to be there doesn't mean he intended his brothers to be wicked. Okay, so that's not teaching Calvinism. The brethren were free, his brothers. They were free to act charitable and act like he was their brother. And why didn't they do this? Why didn't they just say, Joe's off his rocker again. Mom needs to refill his medicine. They had no grace. And because of that, they went to the other extreme. If they could have gotten away with it, and their brother hadn't stood up to them, I think they probably would have murdered him. So you got to be careful the road you get on. Now, his brothers pay for it. Look at Psalm 76, verse 10. God has the ability and does this all the time and will do it. God overrules the wickedness of man. When his brothers sold him into slavery, they didn't expect to see him again. They probably thought he won't survive. Remember, Joseph wasn't a worker. His brothers were out there in the field doing the work. He was just out there wearing new clothes and coming out to tell them about dreams. We don't find Joseph doing any work. So they sold him into slavery thinking, he's not going to make it. He can't even watch sheep. How's he going to make it as a slave? Well, look at Psalm 76, verse 10. He says, surely the wrath of man shall praise thee. God can take any situation and turn it around for his own good. And that's exactly what he did. But that doesn't mean it's okay for you to do anything. You'll still pay for sin. Sin always has a price tag. So we've seen the insult that gets levied in the furnace. Guess what? Life's going to be insulting. You're going to feel like a slave sometime. You are a slave. Somebody bought you. So it's okay if every now and then he makes you feel like a slave, because you are a slave. Maybe sometimes he makes us feel like a slave because we've forgotten it. And so we've got to do a little slave labor. Okay, we're a slave. That's okay. That's the right place to be. Be in the furnace of affliction. That's where he chooses people. It's a good spot. The next thing we'll see, we've seen the famine, the insult. Now we'll see restriction. This just ain't getting any better, is it? Well, a furnace doesn't sound like it's going to get real good, does it? He says, Psalms 105, verse 18. Psalms 105, verse 18. He says, whose feet, talking about Joseph, they hurt with fetters. He was laid in iron. Okay, bad went to worse. He comes to Egypt as a slave. Does he I'm sure in his mind he's thinking, I'll buckle down, I'll become the best slave these people have ever seen, and they'll promote me, and one day I'll work my way out of this position. And it starts working. He's being a good slave. Potiphar says, hey, I like that guy. Let's put him in charge of everything in the house. And they did that. Then, out of no fault of his own, he's accused of something he didn't do. And what's he find himself? How do you get a demotion from slave? But he got one. Now he's in prison. God's still working. The furnace is getting hotter, but it's God working. Sometimes life feels that way for us. When bad goes to worse, it doesn't mean God's forsaken you. It means he's purifying that metal. It's going to be worth something. He goes from slave to prisoner. What a thing. Now you find the story, if you want to go home and read it, it'll be in Genesis 39. Imprisonment is painful. He says there in our verse that they laid him in iron. So when they put him in prison, it wasn't for tax evasion, in the country club. It was the real deal. And I'll bet you in Egypt, they didn't have any country clubs for prisoners. And when they say they put him in irons, they don't mean that was how much nutrition they were giving him. They were putting a lot of iron in his diet. No, they mean it hurt, painful. It says there, whose feet they hurt. There's going to be some restriction. In this life, you can't do everything you see everybody else getting away with. You can't. Just because you're a Christian and you see other people who are Christians getting away with doing some wicked things, don't imagine that God's going to allow you to do it. Sometimes he puts some restriction on you. Guess what? It's okay. Be in the furnace. They won't be chosen. You will. He says in verse 19, Psalms 105, verse 19, it says, the word of the Lord tried him. Wow. Let's think about it for a minute. God promised this family that he's in that they're going to possess Canaan. Well, that hadn't worked out too well, has it? He also promised him something in some dreams. Remember, he had these dreams, and in the dream, Joseph is put up over even his parents and his brethren. He's the high muckety muck. He's number one. Boss man in charge. That ain't working out too well when you wake up in prison in a foreign country. How did he learn the language? I don't know. I'm sure the question that comes to his mind in that jail cell is God going to actually honor his word? Or was that dream I was having about the stars and the sheaves bowing down to me, was that just some bad goat meat I had the day before? I have too much pizza. That was just a bad dream. Or was it really the truth? Guess what? We're going to feel that way. You're going to feel that way. You're going to think, okay, God told me this. He called me to do this, and nothing is working out. Was I wrong? You're going to have that question. You don't think Joseph did? God intends you to be put in that situation. Why? It's the trying of your faith. He says that's precious. Okay, so he's said there that his word tried him. Okay, if God had given him his word on something, and then it doesn't look like it's coming to pass, I'd say that's a trial. Yeah, he's trying him. During the years of his imprisonment, his faith was tried, was tested. And in addition to his faith being tested, something was being added that he didn't even see. What he was getting that he didn't realize was patience. Because he's sitting there in a foreign country after being demoted from servant. He's sitting there in a jail cell, waiting patiently without losing faith. He still believed it. That's tough. God's going to put us in positions like that sometimes, and you're going to think everything is falling apart. There is no way he can do what he told me he was going to do. But he will. Don't lose faith. Hold on. Then, let's see what else happens. You see 2 of Pharaoh's servants come in. Now, I guess if you're going to be a servant, there's probably a pecking order. And you would rather be the servant to Pharaoh than the servant to Potiphar. So these come in. They each have a dream. And Joseph interprets the dream, tells them what it's going to be. Now, don't you think Joseph is sitting there thinking to himself, wait a minute, I had my own dream, and I thought I knew the answer to that. But it didn't stop him. Even though things hadn't turned out the way he had imagined, even though he wasn't sitting in the palace with people bowing down to him, he still got the message out. Same with us. In life, when you ain't getting everything you think you should have, it doesn't matter. Still get the message out. It's important. He says there, until the time that his word came. Okay, the word that he's talking about there is when it had come to pass what he had told the men their dream was. He said, I'll tell you what that dream is. And then he tells the one man you're going to die, tells the next man you're going to be promoted. Matter of fact, it happens just that way. He says, hey now, as soon as this comes to pass, he didn't tell this to the man that's going to die, but he says, as soon as this comes to pass, be sure you get me out of here. Tell them that I interpreted this dream. So I'm sure he's reading the newspaper. He's pulling up CNN or whatever, Fox News or whatever they watch in jail in Egypt. And lo and behold, the man gets promoted just like he said. He said, oh, that's good. I told the guy that was going to happen. It did happen. And I told him to tell the king about me. So any day now. And then day after day after day, nothing. They forgot about him. It's a repeat of the same life lesson he's been learning. Wouldn't you think Joseph would have given up? Said, hey, look, God, you keep putting me through this same meal. I've already learned these lessons. There is no reason to put me back in the fire on this same subject. But he does. He's teaching him patience. Joseph's imprisonment is overruled by God, finally. But it's not done with any warning to Joseph. God didn't come down there and say, hold on, buddy, 3 more days and I'm going to let you out of here. It's just boom, and it happened. That's the way it happens with us. You just keep right on, keep your nose to the grind, do what you're supposed to do, and all of a sudden it'll work out. That's just the way God works. Let's see his release. It says, until the time that his word came. That's the interpretation of the dreams. So he's sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, and his word does come to pass. But then he's still waiting. So the word of God is trying him. It says the word of the Lord tried him. You know what he's trying? He's saying, if I give you the answer to this, I let you use some prophecy to help another person, will you lose faith if things don't turn out great for you? He's trying him. He's testing him. Then it says, look down at verse 22. Psalms 105, verse 22. To bind his princes at his pleasure. Whoa, this is what happens when he gets out of prison. The king Pharaoh tells Joseph, hey look, you can tie anybody up anytime you want to. Now you can make servants out of anybody you want them to, you want to make servants. It says, and while you're at it, I want you to set up a school and teach his senators wisdom. Okay. It works out pretty good, doesn't it? Now he's going to be the head teacher. They're going to set up a college in Pharaoh's house. He's going to teach all his guys something because nobody had any wisdom. He said, oh, I see there's a man with wisdom. Wisdom is not expressed until there's a lack of it. So things got to get pretty bad for wisdom to come to the forefront. And that's exactly what happens in his life. Look at, well, you can read down through there. What happens to this guy is he ends up getting the most authoritative, prestigious position in the land. The Bible says he's second only to Pharaoh in the throne. So Pharaoh has more power, but only Pharaoh. Other than Pharaoh, it's Joe. Don't mess with Joe. Guess what? That's going to be you and I in the millennium and eternity. There's only going to be one more powerful than us. We'll be one flesh with Christ. We see him, we'll be as he is. There will only be one more powerful in the throne, and that'll be God the Father. Otherwise, it'll be, don't mess with me. Okay, that's our eventual end, but we ain't there yet. We got some furnace to go through first, and he's going to put us through it. Okay, so we've seen this furnace. It's a famine, insult, restriction, but it doesn't end there. It ends in excellence. That's the purpose of the furnace. If you take a chunk of gold or silver and you throw it in the fire, it's going to, I don't know if you've seen anybody do it in a, what do they call that thing? A forge, what a forger uses, or a smelting, yeah. They turn that thing on, and I mean that fire gets hot, and it spins and spins, and then when they finally stop it, you can see it actually separate what's good from what's bad. And that's what God's going to do. Now, the reason they do that is not because they think there's no hope. It's because they think there is hope. Because they think they can get some benefit out of that chunk of rock or metal or whatever it is. They think there's something in there that's worth saving. So they separate the trash. Okay, there's excellence in it. Psalms 105, verse 24. This is talking about God. It says, and he increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies. God gave increase and power. These people didn't start out that way. Remember, when the boys come into Egypt, they're just 12 boys. They ain't a nation. They couldn't possibly on their own possess Canaan. They didn't have the strength. So what God does is he brings them into Egypt, protects them, and makes them a mighty nation till they're ready to go take the land. Now they can possess the land he's promised them. That's their end. Look at Job chapter 22. Job 23. Job 23, verse 10. Job 23, 10. He says, but he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, put you in the furnace, I shall come forth as gold. Okay, no coming forth as gold if there ain't no trial. You're just still a lump of clay or a lump of metal with something good somewhere maybe. But it's not useful to anybody until you've been tried. Psalm 66 verse 10, same thing. Psalm 66 verse 10. Not everybody's gold. Not everybody likes gold. They have this stuff called white gold now. I don't know what in the world the purpose of that is. Gold is supposed to be that color, gold. That's right. White gold is silver. Okay, that's called something else, silver. He says in this verse, not everybody comes out as a chunk of gold. Some people come out as silver. Psalm 66 verse 10. For thou, O God, hast proved us. Thou hast tried us as silver is tried. Okay, there's a process to it. You got to get in the furnace, but the end result is excellence. It's a pure metal that comes out. In Psalms 105, verse 37, look back at our text. Psalms 105, verse 37. You know what gold and silver hang out with? They hang out with more gold and silver. Psalms 105, verse 37. He brought them forth also with silver and gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes. The end result of the furnace is excellence. It is. It's going to be a good end. But you have to keep faith in God. You got to know who He is. When you're going through the mess that He's going to put you through, the trial and the testing and the temptations that you have to face, the only thing that's going to keep you strong is knowing the end. We got a book that tells it to us. In Psalms 105, verse 43. Psalms 105, verse 43. Remember, these are the people that leave Egypt. These are the people who were the slaves. They had taskmasters beating them, telling them, make more bricks, go make your own mud, get your own clay, and get it done quicker. It was not a happy life, I wouldn't imagine. However, look what he says here. Psalms 105, verse 43. He brought forth his people with joy, and his chosen with gladness. There's joy and there's gladness coming. You're greatly mistaken, and I am, if we don't rank our afflictions with our mercy that we've been given. The afflictions God's put in our life is merciful because He said that you're worthy to afflict. There's something in you that's worth me getting the real gold out of. Otherwise, He would have said, oh no, that's a chunk of fool's gold. We don't want to mess with that. Just throw that back on the pile. Okay, well, it's nice and easy over there. However, there's no furnace because there's nothing in it worth getting. But if He's giving you some affliction, good. That means He found something worthy in you. The 3 Hebrew children, you remember them, they can attest to this literally. They were thrown into a furnace, a literal furnace. And you know what they would tell you? They'd tell you, don't worry about it. The furnace is for your good, not for your destruction. The furnace burn off their ropes. The restrictions are suddenly gone in that furnace. It didn't mess up their clothes. What they needed, they had. In the furnace of this life that we're in, there's certain things we're going to have. God has promised He's going to take care of your needs. If you really need it, you will have it. He says, food, I'm going to make sure you have food. He says, raiment, clothes, I'm going to make sure you have clothes. You can count on it. In this life, you're going to have food and clothes. Now, it might not be caviar, thank goodness. It might not be polo, but you'll have something you can put on, and you'll have something you can eat. Because that's a promise from God as being in the furnace. You can count on it. In Psalms 105, verse 14 and 15, look what else happens. When you're in the furnace, you can count on this. Psalms 105, verse 14. Now, you're going to have to tell yourself this because the world and your natural fleshly mind is going to say just the opposite. Verse 14. He, talking about God, suffered no man to do them wrong. Yea, He provoked kings for their sake, saying, touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. That furnace is going to protect you. You remember Nebuchadnezzar, or what's his name? Threw the Hebrew children in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar. When he threw the Hebrew children in the fire, he didn't go down anywhere near it. He just stayed back. He said, I got a couple of servant boys. I want y'all to go throw them in. It says they died in the process. So there's a protection in the furnace. There is. He said right there, I wouldn't let anybody do them wrong. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego probably thought, I'm being done wrong. I'm getting thrown into the fire. He said, no, it just looks that way. It's not that way. So we can count on it. If God's put you in the furnace, you got some affliction, no problem. He's not going to let anything happen to you. He's got this. Look at it in 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17. And then I got to hurry. 2 Corinthians 4:17. Second Corinthians 4:17. He says, for our light affliction, as in the furnace of affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding, that's excellent, and eternal weight of glory. The furnace of affliction is sure. From this side, from earth, from the side of being in the furnace, it doesn't feel fair. It doesn't. Because there's some other people that are on the outside, not in the furnace with us. So that doesn't look fair. It doesn't feel fair. It ain't fair. Get over it. But what it produces is not fair either. The furnace is going to produce something that one day will be shown to not be fair to those people who are standing out there. Because he said right there in that verse, we're suffering affliction for a moment, this lifetime. Let's say you live a long lifetime, 20 years. No, I say you live a long lifetime, however long you live. Let's say it's 100 years, okay? And let's say you're afflicted your whole life, 100 years you suffer affliction every day. You know what he says right there? It's but for a moment, and it's light in comparison to what we're going to get. You're going to get an eternal. Uh-oh. Tables just switched. Not 100 years. Not 200. Eternal. No end. Glory. Just the opposite of what suffering was. That's the God we serve. That's the benefit of the furnace. So the furnace of affliction. We've got famine, insult, restriction, and excellence is how it ends. In 1 Peter 5, verse 7, I'll just read these quickly. He says, well, actually turn there. This is a good chapter. 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5, verse 7. Here's how you'll get through this furnace. 1 Peter 5, verse 7. He says, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. Great verse. You're going to need that one. Now he's going to talk about a furnace. Verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Whom resist. Okay, he's going to start lying to you. You got to resist him. Whom resist in the faith. Okay? Hold fast what God said. Don't lose your confidence in God. Knowing that the same afflictions, that furnace you're in, are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. You're not alone. You're not the only one it's happening to. It's happening to other people all around the world. Lots of them. Verse 10. But the God of all grace, who hath called us unto his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after that you have suffered a while. That's what happens in the furnace. But look what happens after that. Make you perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. That's the furnace of affliction. It's fire.
Come ye sinners, lost and lonely, Jesus' blood